The letters to my family, my mother, my father, sisters, my brother, child, they were intended to familiarize them with the situation I was faced with here. Of course, here in prison, we see the repression, the exploitation, the victimization of lower class people.
Welcome to this episode of Rattling the Bars. We're doing something special this month for George Jackson, for the Black August. We are working with Claude Marks from Freedom Archives to do an interview and talk about the life of George Jackson. So, Claude, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much, Eddie. It's great to be in a space with you again.
Okay, so at this point, you're in charge of this interview, so I'm here for the ride.
Okay, well, August 21st, of course, marks the 50th anniversary of the assassination of George Jackson in San Quentin prison. And we're putting together not so much a tribute, but a resource, which is why we wanted to speak to you. And so, in a way, the interesting thing is this is a reverse, right? Rather than you interviewing me, I'm interviewing you. And we'll kind of get to why that's happening. And as I launch into really my first question to you, Eddie, which is how did you first hear about George Jackson?
Well, we first heard about George Jackson because we were members of the Black Panther Party. So when he joined the Black Panther Party and was made a field marshal, then everybody in the Black Panther Party was informed about him. But prior to that, we actually wasn't very aware of him. Uh, the Soledad situation had happened. But it wasn't getting national news coverage. And but by him becoming part of the Black Panther Party, it immediately got national news coverage.
So knowing that you never met him, you were on opposite sides of the country, and of course he was imprisoned. How did learning about him and how did he influence you?
Well, learning about him, I mean, we got to read. He was a prolific writer, and he was writing a number of things. And some of it was being printed individually. Some of it was being printed in the Black Panther Party paper. We actually started looking and studying as how he was operating in the California prison system. And we looked at the conditions that he operated in. Obviously, he was in a prison system that that had a mixture of Latinos, and it had a mixture of whites and blacks, and the three groups pretty much did not get along very well. And so there were always conflicts and clashes. And I think part of what George Jackson had to do was figure out how to organize in the Black population and protect the Black population, but at the same time, educate people around the struggle of anti-capitalism. So we looked at him, we studied what he was doing, and then we compared and contrasted to where we were. We were in Maryland, and our population was primarily Black, 75 to 80%, with the white population being in the minority 20 to 25%. So we never had a problem of being attacked by white people, white prisoners, even though the guards were constantly instigating that kind of stuff. The white population itself knew that that was not a win-win situation for them. But then we also realized that we wanted to do some organizing similar to what George Jackson was doing, to just kind of like, one, to protect ourselves, but two, to organize the greater population. So we studied him. We studied other prison situations and movements, and at some point decided how we would operate and how we would move forward.
So there's a couple things this brings to mind. One is, addressing the issue of race within the prison. One of the things that he was well known for was to really drive home the political point that the internal contradictions among prisoners and among sets within the prison um, should not be pursued to the benefit of the institution itself. So it really had to do with identifying who the oppressor was in a broader sense. Did you get that sense from what you were reading about him and the things that he was putting out?
Yes, I think he was a great theoretician. Oh, and he was a practitioner too. Obviously, a revolutionary, a comrade. But yes, I think that was the position, and I think that's why he was eventually recruited to the Black Panther Party. I think that was the position of the Black Panther Party. We understood that there would be down on the ground conflicts and contradictions, but that didn't supersede the major contradiction of how the capitalist ruling class was treating all of us down on the ground, and that the only way forward would have been unity. And I think he was always, in his writings and his application, was always pushing that idea. We were pushing that idea. That's the only way out of this whole situation, is for us to unify. Uh, and divide and conquer only serves Caesar. So yeah, we understood that, and we understood he understood it, and we learned from that. But in some cases, even when you learn from that, you still have to protect yourself from those right-wing fanatics or other activities or other groups. And in the case of Maryland, we had the drug dealers in the prison system that we had to organize against and protect ourselves against. But that's internal contradictions.
So one of the things that we found really kind of triggering in terms of thinking about him 50 years later was the prison did an inventory of 99 books in his cell. What stands out for you in terms of that list, in terms of, how do we understand what he was reading and what he was interested in, and how did that impact on how he was teaching and what he was teaching?
I don't remember all the books on the list, but it was a list that covered revolutionary struggles around the world: Cuba, Vietnam, China, Africa, Algiers, South Africa, etc., South America, Europe. It covered philosophy. It covered so many different things. It looked at fascism, mass psychology and fascism, and so on. He was not just he was well read, but he was a probably in the prison system. Of course, that's after Malcolm X had left. He was probably the intellectual among prisoners throughout the nation, in terms of his insight, in terms of him he looked 1,000 years into the future, you know, and he knew that this wasn't just one of those things that would just happen. But he looked at long-term strategy. So his books kind of encompass that. So he looked back in history and he realized that that we had a relationship with the struggles that occurred for the last couple thousand years. Um, so I think his books indicate that, his writings indicate that, and I think later on he's probably, and I would say this, probably the most well-read prisoner among prisoners than anybody else.
So one story that I remember you getting into in a previous interview was starting actually a book club within the prison that took from his thinking and his writing. Maybe you could talk about that for just a moment.
Yes, well. One of the things that we did, and I had comrades outside. My brother, uh, Paul Coates, who was a former defense captain in the Black Panther Party. He was outside. He was supporting our internal struggle inside the prison. We made a determination. What I found when I stepped in the prison system was that there was no library. There was like 4,000 people and no books. And it was deliberate. It was intentional. The guards did not want prisoners to read. So one of the first things we did as we started organizing was to organize to get books inside the prison. And to do that outside, well, Paul created the George Jackson Prison Project, and we worked with outside to ship books inside the prisoners, and we took over a couple of cells, and we built a library in the prison in among the housing area. And it was so embarrassing that the state ended up getting money, allocating money to build a library, because they did not want us in charge of a library, and they could not justify having 4,000 people and no library. But it was the George Jackson Prison Project that we worked on that eventually turned into the Black Classic Press, which is now probably the largest private owned Black press in this side of the Mississippi. But all of this started because we recognized the work that George Jackson was doing, and we wanted it to be plain for people outside and inside what we were saying and what we were talking about, and using George Jackson's name made that very clear to everybody on all sides of the equation.
You know, the books, the writing, the ideas. This is sort of a leading question, but for you, why did the state find him so dangerous?
Well, the state found him so dangerous really because of his ideas. A lot of people look at the Black Panther Party, or they look at self-defense, or they look at militant actions, or they look at survival programs, and they order newspapers, and they think all of those things might be a reason for the state to fear. But what the state feared was the ideas, the ideology of the wealth of the world belongs to the people of the world, and people need to organize and gain control of that wealth and gain control of those industries and make them work in the benefit of people on the planet. That was the most scariest thing to a capitalist and a parasite who's trying to accumulate all the wealth for themselves. So it was that ideology that made him the greatest threat. They didn't care about any of the rest. I mean, they did care about the rest of the stuff, but the idea was the most dangerous of all. And that was something that was resonating throughout the prison systems in America. You could get the Soledad Brothers. You could get all kinds of material with George Jackson's name, and it would pop up in Connecticut, it would pop up in Florida, in Texas, it would pop up in Oregon, and the prison officials and the ruling class officials had to stop that. The same way they had to marginalize Huey, Bobby, Stokely, etc., and a number of other people that were targeted, including Martin Luther King.
So we don't know in the most detailed way possible, but certainly other people we've spoken to have referenced his assassination in the context of Cointelpro. Have you a sense of the kind of continuity of state strategy, having been locked up yourself?
Yes, COINTELPRO, and that's the thing is that COINTELPRO, and you just Judas and the Black Messiah kind of like pointed it out a little bit. You look at it, and it looks like there's a direct link between the FBI and the local police and whatever activities take place. But COINTELPRO actually operated like an octopus, and it used the LAPD, it used the New York PD, it used police departments, it used federal agencies, internal revenue, it used the postal service, it used every industry institution that the government could touch was available to COINTELPRO. And there's no question in my mind, um, and and I don't know whatever happened to Louis Tackwood and the Glass House tape. And there's hundreds of obviously conspiracies, but there's no question in my mind that this whole thing was manipulated to eventually assassinate George Jackson. Um, and the government was behind it. And it's always questionable, even with Malcolm X, it's questionable where that authority stopped at. Did it stop at the CIA? Did it stop at the FBI? Did it stop at the House Un-American Activity Committee? Where did it stop? It doesn't matter. It's the government itself have targeted uh, first the Black Panther Party, then Jonathan Jackson, and then ultimately George Jackson.
And of course, part of the aftermath, shortly, in fact, afterwards, at the beginning of September, we had the Attica Rebellion.
Yes.
As well as, triggering really a wave of resistance from within the prisons in the United States. So the sense of outrage and the sense of needing to fight for human rights was really embedded within that whole, struggle that he contextualized very sharply in his own writing. So that's part of the legacy as well. So one of the ways to try to wrap up, I think, is, given our perspective today, 50 years later, not only what stands out for you as a lesson, but what part of that lesson is particularly useful for younger people today?
Well, I think probably 50 years later, what's useful is several things. One, to study, to read, to understand, to develop a full analysis of what it is we're dealing with and how we can deal with it. That's one thing. The other thing was that George Jackson was, like I say, a practitioner. And so he also demonstrated by staying in shape, taking care of himself, by writing and reaching out to people as much as he could. So it's theory and it's practice. That was true 50 years ago, that's true today. Young people need to develop that theory, and then they need to figure out how to apply under today's conditions practice. One of the things that George, and there's always a lot of debate about fascism. It's not here. It's not. It's we're just being repressed. For some groups of people, the indigenous population has been under a fascist kind of occupation since day one, and most of them have disappeared, unfortunately. For other people, 200, 300, 400 years of enslavement and hanging from the trees in the South and the North. To us, that appears to be fascism. George was always saying fascism was coming. Now, I recognize fascism is not here. They made a serious effort to January the 6th, but they're not here yet, and they want to be here. But in some cases, we have lived under the cloak of fascism. And George was always pointing that out. He was pointing out that the thing about fascism is that, and the most simplest thing about fascism is it reforms, and it keeps coming back to you in different shapes. And after George Bush, it comes back as George Bush Light Obama. After Obama, it comes back as Crazy Trump. After Crazy Trump, it comes back as Trump Light Biden. And so fascism continues to reform, and it continues to present itself as your friend until such time that you are alone and isolated and disappear. So, that George was constantly pointing out, and we need to pay attention to that going into the future.
Well, that seems like a good way to end on a powerful note. It's always good to be in a space with you. Unfortunately, given today's conditions, it's virtual, but hopefully that won't be the case in the future. And just thank you very much for doing this and contributing to the project that we're working on that'll be on the web.
Okay, thanks for having me. And this is beneficial to us too. So I appreciate that.
Well, good. To be continued.
Okay. And as a final note, thank you for joining this episode of Rattling the Bars.